Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Loretta Lyons. I'm the programming librarian at Guilford Free Library. Today's program is the second in a three-part series with Bob Potter on the Modern Masters, great artists of the 20th century. The focus today will be on the artists of the New West. I'd like to thank SIL for co-sponsoring this series with the library. Art lecture presenter Bob Potter is a graduate of Syracuse University School of Visual and Performing Arts. He spent his early career as an art director and creative director for leading media companies, including Scholastic Magazines, Time Warner, and National Geographic. He was a corporate development officer for the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Over the past decade, he has managed an innovative art therapy program for Save the Children, headed marketing and communications for Mystic Seaport Museum, launched a professional development program for art students at the Lime Academy College of Fine Arts, and is a docent at the Yale Center for British Art. So today we'll take an intermission about halfway through, and if you would like to ask a question, then you can just type it into the at the bottom of your screen using the Q&A tool. We are in a webinar this time as opposed to a Zoom meeting, so please type your questions and we'll take as many as we can. And now please join me in welcoming Bob Potter.
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you again, Loretta, and thanks again to the Guilford Library and the Schiller Shoreline Institute of Lifelong Learning for hosting this art lecture. And we are going to go out west today, but I call it the New West because we're going to look at the West through the eyes and the art of 20th century artists. George O'Keeffe, photographer Ansel Adams, painters Richard Diebenkorn and Ed Ruscha. And as we saw last week, part of these lectures are really an opportunity to meet artists, see iconic works, but hopefully they will inspire you to continue to learn more about these artists. And that's where Google and YouTube come in very, very handy. And do make sure the sound is up on your device, whether it's a laptop or whatever. And runs about an hour, this talk, and we will have some time kind of midpoint. So use the little chat app down at the bottom of your screen, type in some questions for Loretta, and then also at the end. So, the American West. Few painters created more dramatic landscapes of the American West than Albert Bierstadt. He was born in Germany in 1830, and he was brought to America by his parents, and they lived in New Bedford, Massachusetts. After painting with artists in New England and upstate New York, known as the Hudson River School of Artists, he headed west in 1859, joining a land surveyor for the US government. Albert Bierstadt would ecstatically describe the new frontier in the mid-19th century. And he'd write, quote, "Truly all is remarkable and a wellspring of amazement and wonder. Man is so fortunate to dwell in this American Garden of Eden." So before our 20th century artists who we'll be seeing today, Bierstadt was one of the first American artists to go west and see this new world. Then in the summer of 1873, at the age of 35, the artist Thomas Moran headed west to join the US government surveyor John Wesley Powell on a trip to the Grand Canyon. He was going along with a party of travelers that included a correspondent for the New York Times who sent back east vivid accounts of the adventure and hardships they all endured. This Thomas Moran painting is of Zion Valley, South Utah. One of his most famous paintings is The Mirage, painted in 1879. Moran would say that his goal was to capture what he would call the true impression of a scene rather than a literal topographical view. He would do a series of magnificent paintings of the Green River Valley in what was then the Wyoming Territory. In this painting, titled The Mirage, done in 1879, we see a band of native inhabitants ride into a landscape of towering cliffs and blue sky reflected in the water. The moon has just risen in the horizon. In the 20th century, the Western landscape would continue to attract artists, and it would inspire and become the focus of one artist from New York City. Her name was Georgia O'Keeffe. She would paint her own personal visions of the Southwest in and around her Taos, New Mexico studio. She once said about why she became an artist, quote, "I found I could say things with colors and shapes that I couldn't say any other way." In New York, she would begin as an artist. Her painting here of a New York City skyscraper was done in 1925. Can't you almost hear Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue playing in the background as the moon peeks through the clouds? Her paintings of flowers present a close-up of nature's beauty, letting us see what only a bee or a butterfly gets to see. But she would become perhaps most famous for her Southwest paintings like Black Mesa Landscape, New Mexico, done in 1930. Snow-capped mountains with midnight blue shadows above pink undulating hills, a green skim of trees and a strip of snow below. She would combine flowers with found objects, especially bleached bones, skulls she collected from the desert floor. As this painting, Ram's Head, White Hollyhock, New Mexico, done in 1935. She juxtaposes the skeleton of a ram's head against a blue desert sky and low hills, which makes perfect compositional sense for a Western painting. But then she accents it all with that white hollyhock flower. Now imagine the painting without the flower. The animal skeletons and landscape make it Western art. The flower makes it Georgia O'Keeffe's art of the West, where realism and surrealism meet. Georgia O'Keeffe was born in 1887 in the town of Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, and has been recognized as the mother of American modernism. In her early years, she studied at many art schools around the country, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Art Students League of New York, but she often felt constrained by her lessons, which focused on literally recreating or copying what was in nature. In 1915, when she was 28 years old, she would embrace abstraction. And she would call these works dream drawings from her subconscious, which reflect the growing influence of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis and surrealism art. Alfred Stieglitz, an art dealer and photographer in New York, discovered her work in 1916 and included examples at his 291 gallery on Lower Fifth Avenue. The 291 gallery was introducing modern art to America for the first time, including the works of Matisse, Rodin, Cezanne, and the first showing in America of a radical Spanish artist working in Paris, Pablo Picasso. George O'Keeffe and Stieglitz would soon become passionate lovers and marry in 1924. Stieglitz would take and exhibit explicit and sensuous photographs of George O'Keeffe, which he considered his greatest works of art. He would take more than 330 photographs of O'Keeffe between 1917 and 1937. She would later write about these intimate photographs. We would make love, and afterwards, he would take photographs of me. From 1916 until 1946, photographer Alfred Stieglitz and painter George O'Keeffe wrote each other nearly 25,000 letters, sometimes 2 and 3 times a day, some of them 40 pages long. And somehow she still found time to paint. During this period, O'Keeffe created many studies of flowers, like this painting of Oriental poppies done in 1927. She was an avid gardener herself and was often inspired to make a dozen or more paintings of a specific flower, tightly cropped with flowering petals that explode in vibrant, saturated color, like petunias, done in 1925, and red canna, done in 1924. Many art critics and viewers believe these paintings by O'Keeffe were intentionally erotic, visual metaphors of women's sexuality, although O'Keeffe consistently denied that intention in her paintings. O'Keeffe has said that she made the paintings to reflect the way that she saw flowers. The reputation of the portrayal of women's sexuality was also fueled by the nude photographs that Stieglitz had taken and exhibited of O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe would continue to paint flowers in the Southwest, like this flower called the Jimson weed, a desert plant that blooms in the cool evening hours and thrived in the territory near O'Keeffe's house in Taos, New Mexico. In one of her most ambitious floral still lifes, O'Keeffe magnifies the white trumpet blossoms of the Jimson weed, arranging them in an exuberant composition charged with energy and movement. The radical manipulation of scale was one of the innovations of the modernist movement. But it wasn't long before George O'Keeffe would escape the canyons of New York City for the mountain canyons and deserts of the West. O'Keeffe began spending part of the year in New Mexico, finding new inspiration for her paintings in the dramatic Western landscapes. As she did in her flowering paintings, O'Keeffe used broad brushstrokes of color, shape, and form to depict mountain ranges in the background and desert sagebrush in the foreground that flow like windswept ocean waves. In the bleached bones of a cow skull, she finds austere beauty in her painting. This painting, Cow Skull, Red, White, and Blue, was done in 1931. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. O'Keeffe isolates a single skull, highlights its jagged edges, worn surfaces, and ghostly color. To O'Keeffe, such bones represented the desert's enduring beauty and strength of the American spirit, which she alludes to in the red stripes and blue and white background. After Stieglitz's death in 1946, she lived and painted permanently in New Mexico, where she would live until her death in 1986 at the age of 99. The Georgia O'Keeffe Museum was established in Santa Fe after her death. Now, I'd like to share with you a vintage little excerpt from a film on Georgia O'Keeffe that was done quite a few years ago. And what I'm going to do is just escape for a second. Let's see how we do that. I want to make sure that the sound and the video is optimized. Hang on there. Whoops. Okay, whoops, not working there. Okay. So we're going to try this one more time. Here we go. And Loretta, let me know how sound and video are working, and we'll make an adjustment if needed here. All right.
The first year I was out here, because there were no flowers, I began picking up bones. Well, I wanted to take something home. I wanted to take something home to work on. I had a whole pile in the patio there. I wasn't painting them right then, but I had to get them first. And when it was time to go home, I felt I hadn't started on the country. And I wondered what I could take home that I could continue what I felt about the country. And I couldn't think of anything to take home but a barrel of bones. So when I got home with my barrel of bones to Lake George, I stayed up there quite a while that fall and painted. That's where I began, that's where I painted my first skulls, from this barrel of bone. And first I painted a horse's head. And then I got this cow's head. And I had the cow's head painted against the blue. And I thought, well, I have to do something else about that. And that was at the time that the men were all talking about the great American novel, the great American play, the great American, oh, it was the great American everything. And I thought they didn't know anything about America. A lot of them had never been across the Hudson. So I thought, I'll make my picture a red, white, and blue. I'll make it an American painting for these people that don't go across the Hudson. And this was my painting. I put a red stripe down each side. Entertained me, but I don't think anybody else caught on to it for quite a while. Another thing I collected was artificial flowers that they had in all the little country stores. Poor artificial flowers, but sometimes they were very pretty. The bones do not symbolize death to me. They are shapes that I enjoy. It never occurs to me that they have anything to do with death. They are very lively.
No, Georgia O'Keeffe denies that it has anything to do with death. She does not associate it with death. For instance, that pelvis series of the bones she found on the desert. She holds them up and then sees the mountain through the hole in the bone, so that she goes through this into nature. You can take it as a symbol of a sort of concrete immortality in these things too, that they outlast death itself.
They please me. And I have enjoyed them very much in relation to the sky. I thought it's very easy to always be having a bone with a blue hole in it. I'd better make it another color. So I had a reddish bone with a yellow sky. That wasn't too bad either.
Where do you suppose you got the idea of being an artist?
I haven't the faintest idea. I often think about it and wonder, but I had it in my head when I was, well, I couldn't have been 12 when I had that idea.
You had what idea?
That I wanted to be a painter. I was going to be a painter. First.
So as George O'Keeffe was painting her Western landscapes, and as we saw delightfully what they meant to her, what she saw, she would call these forays into the far away. And let me, how's that? Are we good there?
That's great, Bob. Thank you.
Good, good. Good picture. Good. So as George O'Keeffe is painting these iconic landscapes of the Southwest, another artist would use his camera. Rather than paint and canvas, to create what are considered some of the most timeless and stunning images ever portrayed of the American West. His name was Ansel Adams. He was born in San Francisco in 1902, and one of his earliest memories at the age of 4 was of the smoke from the fires caused by the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. An aftershock of the earthquake tossed the 4-year-old Ansel Adams into a garden wall, breaking and scarring his nose, which remained crooked all of his life. He was an only child, and his father gave him his first camera, a Kodak Brownie box camera, basically a cardboard box with a simple lens and roll of film. It cost $1. Eastman Kodak introduced the camera in 1900, and it would revolutionize photography, letting the masses take a snapshot. Ansel Adams would take his Brownie camera on his first trip to Yosemite National Park in 1916 when he was 14 years old. The little camera and the big trip would change his life. From then on, mounted atop his classic Woody station wagon, now using a large format mounted 8x10 camera, Ansel Adams would return again and again to Yosemite. It would become his Mecca. He'd return every season to photograph its majestic natural wonders. What makes Ansel Adams' photographs so stunning is the technical virtuosity he brings to composition, detail, exposure, and printing, capturing the full range of darks and lights, blacks and grays and whites, and all the tonal values in between. His mastery of black and white photography can be seen in every Ansel Adams photographs, like this photograph of Mount Williamson, Sierra Nevada, mountains and boulders. The sliver of a river mirroring a gray sky of clouds and sunlight. The shapes and textures of an adobe church in dark and light grays of shadow. Silvery white aspen trees against a dark forest as they shoot up and stand above gray brush. One of his most famous paintings, Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Adams talks about how he got that perfect exposure, that perfect moment, that moment where the moon has risen, and yet we see the landscape in all its detail. It's hard to believe we're looking at this in a black and white photograph. This is another one of his most famous photographs. It's Winter Sunrise, Sierra Nevada. And here's a little film from the Smithsonian Channel about this iconic photograph by Ansel Adams. And Loretta, let me know how we're doing with sound and picture. The next artist whose work we'll be looking at saw the American West from a unique perspective. It wasn't the landscapes of mountains and deserts, flowers. It was the urban landscape of the West. Another artist we'll be looking at will paint abstract meditations of color, looking at the streets of Santa Monica. Let's look at this artist first. The California Matisse. In the late 1960s, Richard Diebenkorn, a painter in Santa Monica, California, was creating a series of tranquil, glowing canvases that made his reputation and transfixed art lovers. These were called the Ocean Park series, which Diebenkorn would begin painting in 1967, soon after moving from San Francisco to Southern California to accept a teaching position at UCLA. His friend and fellow painter, Sam Francis, invited him to take over his studio in Ocean Park, a working class neighborhood in the southwest corner of Santa Monica. At that time, it was a derelict area filled with bars and rescue missions, and its low rents attracted many artists. Today, the same Santa Monica neighborhood is filled with trendy shops, restaurants, and multi-million-dollar condominiums. Back in 1967, Diebenkorn's studio sat on a hillside, where instead of gazing at the ocean, he looked out his window and up the hill. He studied the geometry of the hill and how the streets crossed one another. His 1969 oil painting, Ocean Park Number 24, is now in the Yale University Art Gallery Museum. It shows Main Street running through the Ocean Park neighborhood of Santa Monica, 2 blocks from the Pacific Ocean. Now, it may seem counterintuitive that he turned his back on the ocean and looked up the hill instead. But Diebenkorn was more interested in light and shape and color than he was in looking at water. His Ocean Park paintings would signal a dramatic shift from his earlier works. In the 1950s and 60s, before his Ocean Park series, Diebenkorn was painting in a style vigorously influenced by abstract expressionism. He was also very engaged with exploring figurative works. On the left is an abstract entitled Berkeley, number 22, and on the right, a painting he calls Figure on a Porch. In both paintings, though, I think we can see hints of the geometric shapes and forms that would later be his visual hallmarks in his Ocean Park paintings. Diebenkorn would say about his dramatic shift from figurative to abstract painting, quote, "Maybe someone from the outside observing what I was doing would have known what was about to happen. I didn't see the signs. Then one day I was thinking about abstract painting again. Then suddenly I abandoned the figure altogether." Diebenkorn played music in his studio while he painted. He loved Bach and Mozart, and he would often sit for hours staring at a painting, only standing to paint almost out of exasperation when he felt he had to do something other than sit and listen to music. Richard Diebenkorn's 1975 work, Ocean Park, number 79, is a gorgeous composition of color. It features pastel blues, lavenders, and aquas, and thin strips of deep red and green at the top, which draw the viewer's gaze upward. It's a big canvas. It measures 7 by 8 feet. And it's also full of little painterly moments and surprises as Diebenkorn leaves little drips of paint while he applies his paint to the canvas. Diebenkorn named each piece of this series with a number in the order by which he made them. Ocean Park, number 137, was painted in 1985. And it arrived at New York Knoedler's Gallery straight from the artist's Santa Monica studio. The painting was acquired by the actress Mary Tyler Moore and her husband, Dr. Robert Levine. Recently, Ocean Park number 137, measuring more than 8 feet in height, was sold for $22,587,000 at Christie's. Now, this may be a surprise. It was to me as I learned more about Diebenkorn. The most influential artist on Diebenkorn's work was Henri Matisse. Matisse's flattened perspectives, patterns, and composition and bright painterly brushstrokes of color, line, and shape would have a profound and lasting inspiration on Diebenkorn's own work. On the left is Matisse's Red Room from 1908, and on the right, Diebenkorn's Recollections of a Visit to Leningrad from 1965. In 2017, the Baltimore Museum of Art mounted a major exhibition entitled Matisse Diebenkorn, showing these and other examples from their collection of Matisse and Diebenkorn paintings. Let's look at this short film about the influence of Matisse on Diebenkorn from the CBS Sunday Morning Show. And Loretta, let me know how the sound is working on this. And picture.
They were born nearly 50 years and an ocean
good, Bob.
apart. Henri Matisse is a household name in this country. He's a French painter, but many Americans have never heard of Richard Diebenkorn.
I know, and I'm hoping that that will change.
Change curator Katie Rothkopf says, as viewers see the work of Matisse, the French post-impressionist master, and Diebenkorn, the influential but less known American modernist, side by side for the first time.
We have 92 works in this exhibition, 56 by Diebenkorn and 36 by Matisse.
Now on view at the Baltimore Museum of Art, the exhibit will travel to San Francisco in the spring. What do you think are the greatest similarities between these two artists?
They both loved color, and I think they both just had a magic touch with the paintbrush.
The two never met, but the similarity was more than mere coincidence. Richard Diebenkorn studied Matisse almost obsessively.
He was someone who was a real student, and certainly there were other artists that influenced him throughout his life, but no one more than Matisse.
One reason that Diebenkorn is less well known than other important artists of the mid-20th century is that he lived and worked in America's West, far from New York, then the epicenter of modern art in America.
And your paintings look beautiful. Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure.
Born in 1922 in Portland, Oregon, and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, Diebenkorn began drawing as a toddler, eventually going on to study art at Stanford.
He was working in the abstract expressionist mode. He loved abstraction, and that was certainly the style of the time.
He first saw Matisse in 1943 and was hooked. Over the years, traveling as far as Paris and St. Petersburg to view the older artist's work. But Diebenkorn never sought to imitate Matisse.
I think he felt very much that it was important to look to the past, and why would you not look at something that someone else had done? You know, it didn't mean that you were copying them. It just meant that they were inspiring you.
Both men produced abstract and figurative works, some with flattened, muted colors, others with vibrant, recognizable images.
This was painted in 1967 by Richard Diebenkorn.
The yellow. Was this a color that he came to like a lot? Because there are.
He liked a lot of colors, and he liked bold color.
And you've got it next to the Henri Matisse, the yellow dress.
Now, Diebenkorn would have seen this painting, but we certainly don't have any evidence that his painting was a direct response, but certainly one that it would have been in his mind.
This one's probably my mother. A little tired of posing, perhaps.
Gretchen Diebenkorn Grant is the daughter of the late painter. Did you, at any time while you were growing up, realize that he was indeed influenced by Henri Matisse?
Oh, yes. He had a wonderful collection of art books. He had more Matisse books than anything else. People would give them to him all the time.
And on the day we visited the Baltimore Museum of Art, she got to meet Sophie Matisse, Henri's great-granddaughter, for the very first time.
They look at the world in a sort of similar way. I'm looking around while I'm saying this to see the sensibilities. The work is not the same, but it's very definitely related.
But they kind of exchange kind of a mystical language between the two of them that I think comes out in this show that's just breathtaking.
The parallels are unmistakable.
I love these two paintings.
The interior-exterior of both of them is so prominent, so important.
That was something they both were really interested
Yes.
in, that contrast of light and color.
Absolutely.
Richard Diebenkorn died in 1993 at the age of 70, nearly 40 years after Matisse's death. Diebenkorn lived to witness his own success, but since he never met the man who influenced him along the way, their relationship is left to the canvas and our imaginations. It's lovely that you two are having the chance to meet. Don't you imagine what a conversation between these two artists would have been?
I'm sure that my father would have loved to have met Matisse.
How do you know they're not like up there looking down?
Nice. Before we go on to California Cool and our last artist, I thought we could just take a moment, a pause, and any questions that you might want to put into the little chat app. If you have some or comments, we can take a moment and try to address, or we can save them for the end of the lecture.
While we're taking a moment to see if anyone wants to type in a question, I'm wondering where you might see, where's a good place to go see a Diebenkorn painting? I'm sad that I missed that Baltimore Museum of Art exhibit. That looked amazing.
Well, Diebenkorn's prominence just so exploded towards the end of the 20th century, and his works can be seen in many collections. Most major museums, if they're fortunate enough, will have a Diebenkorn. One very nearby is at the Yale University Art Gallery. That's the Diebenkorn 1969 Ocean Park number 24 painting. So can just take that short drive from the Guilford area and pop over there and see that in person. One nice thing I thought about that, again, wonderful, and CBS Sunday Morning does wonderful short films on artists, and that was one of their best. As you saw the scale of those paintings as they walked through the exhibition at the Baltimore Museum. So the impact, and it's been commented that, you know, each painting numbered, and when you sort of get down to the one that Mary Tyler Moore, that was number 137, Ocean Park. So we know, well, at least 137 paintings of the Ocean Park series. So it might be, you know, you could sort of think, gosh, no one has been more sort of obsessed and focused on painting the same subject over and over again than maybe perhaps Monet and his water lilies. So in any event, yeah.
So there's a brief comment from Brett Searle. I've never heard of Diebenkorn before, and his work is fascinating. So we just wanted to say thank you for introducing him to him. And a question from—
Well, I'll just comment on that. You're quite welcome, Brett, because I also know you have spent quite a bit of time in Santa Monica. So you know those locations of the Diebenkorn paintings probably quite well. So yeah, glad you got to discover Diebenkorn.
And one last question, the date of that Baltimore show, do you—
Yeah, that was, gosh, that's been, oh golly, that was a few years ago.
I can type it in the chat later.
Yeah, type in the chat, and I think also could probably just pop into Google, Matisse Diebenkorn, Baltimore Museum of Art. And I forget where it said in the film where it was going to next, how much that traveled. But that's been a few years ago, and I'm sad to say that I didn't get to see that in person. My gosh, what a show that would have been. Okay.
Okay.
Good comments. Thank you. Okay. We've gone from Santa Monica. Now we're going to go to where California is even as or more cool with our final artist. The last artist we're going to meet today creates a sometimes dreamlike realism to express his Southern California and most notably Los Angeles. His name is Ed Ruscha, and we'll get to why it's pronounced that way in just a moment. Ed Ruscha remains one of the most influential Los Angeles painters, printmakers, and photographers who's developed a vibrant signature style. He likes to combine words and images, objects, and landscapes in a deadpan way, like Standard Station done in 1966. This is in the Museum of Modern Art. Sometimes he's playful and humorous with words and images and color, like Honk, done in 62. It's at the Tate Museum, London. Or Ripe, a visual commentary on grapes and jam and the opportunity to paint something that looks like, well, it is jam, kind of running on the screen. But it can also be sinister. 90% angel, 10% devil. Ed Ruscha began experimenting with the subject of gas stations, like his iconic Standard Station, Amarillo, Texas, 1963, which was at the time very much associated with pop art. Pop art, like the ubiquitous Andy Warhol Campbell soup can, or the Roy Lichtenstein homage to comic books. But Ed Ruscha, thinking about these iconic images that a hallmark of pop art was images that we don't think of as art, soup cans and comic books. But the appeal was as much the opportunity for someone who was trained in illustration and graphic design and the graphic composition of his standard oil gas stations. It all started with a series of books that Ruscha created back in 1963. His first book was 26 Gasoline Stations. Reproduced a series of banal black and white photographs the artist took while driving on Route 66 between Los Angeles and his hometown of Oklahoma City. The book would go on to influence a generation of artists with its industrial styles and casual look. That year, he converted the photographs, this otherwise ordinary drive-by locale, into a dramatic, even mysterious symbol of the American vernacular landscape. Ruscha creates a monumental 5 by 10-foot painting titled Standard Station, Amarillo, Texas, based on one of the book's photographs, but with a radically foreshortened composition. As Matisse remained fascinated with interiors, and Monet water lilies, Diebenkorn with the hillside streets of Santa Monica, Ed Ruscha would endlessly play with and experiment with how to transform his iconic Standard gas station over and over, even in one work, setting it on fire. Ed Ruscha is to pop art in the West as Andy Warhol was the king of pop in New York City. But where Warhol was a bit bizarre with his silver wig, Ed Ruscha was Marlon Brando cool in his white t-shirt.
The artist's name is pronounced Edward Ruscha. He goes by Ed Ruscha. When he was a young, what you might call emerging artist, he actually had business cards printed with his name spelled out phonetically, Edward Ruscha, so that people would know exactly how to pronounce it. Ed Ruscha defies easy categorization as an artist. He is simultaneously known as a pop artist, a conceptual artist, a surrealist artist. In fact, he's probably all three. He was early identified with the West Coast pop movement. Ed was a member of the so-called cool school of art. A New York journalist once described Ed Ruscha as a triple threat artist, someone who was as adept at painting and photography as he was at printmaking. And in fact, the artist works in a variety of media over time: paintings, prints, drawings, photographs, and artist books. Most definitely, the two subjects most associated with Ed Ruscha are early subjects: the Standard gasoline station and the iconic Hollywood sign. Ed Ruscha is probably best known as someone who uses words as subjects in his imagery. He says, "Some artists paint flowers, I paint words." Ed Ruscha has always been interested in words and letter forms. When he was in college, he worked as a printer's devil in a typography workshop, and then later on as a graphic designer. So words have always been a part of his thinking. He likes to record words in notebooks. These are words that he overhears in conversation, words that he sees in signs and billboards, words from musical lyrics that he hears in recordings or on the radio. He lists those words in pages of his notebook, and as he says, all those words have temperatures, and when they become really hot, that's when he decides to use them in his art. The writer J.G. Ballard once described Ed Ruscha as having the coolest gaze in America. And certainly there is a sense of cool detachment in a lot of the works. That might indicate an artist who has a very sort of cool personality, and he certainly is a cool guy. But there is probably no other artist alive in America today who is as beloved as Ed Ruscha. He's just an all-around nice guy. Ed Ruscha has a very dry, laconic sense of humor, and it comes through in so many of the works in this show. Every time I think about the exhibition, even when I was writing my essay for the exhibition catalog, there was always a smile on my face. And I challenge any viewer to go through that show and not break out in a smile.
Normally I don't run through the credits, but I like that music so much. I just liked hearing it again and again. Ed Ruscha sometimes invokes a spiritual take in the words and images. Sometimes a sense of religion, a particular kind of heaven, looking at the landscapes around us. He likes to juxtapose familiar words against snow-capped Technicolor mountains north of LA, or words denoting a universal street intersection. Is this his homage to the famous corner of Hollywood and Vine? His word paintings combine his mastery of silkscreen, typography, gradation of color, and an overall graphic composition that has a kind of beautiful coldness that can be emotionally unsettling sometimes, full of hidden meaning, or simply just make you smile. Sometimes it's what you see is what you see, like a cold beer. His painting of the iconic Hollywood sign. In these paintings is both literally and figuratively an artist all about Los Angeles and his take on a city and our culture that is made up of the real and the artificial, the American dream. In a larger sense, his paintings continue a tradition of artists who have been inspired by the West. I want to close with a little final video on Ed Ruscha, which is narrated by the actor and art lover, Owen Wilson.
I'm going to play this tune called Good Night, My Love, and this kind of represents everything that I felt about California when I first came out here.
Good night, my love.
Ed Ruscha has been making work in Los Angeles for the better part of a century. People often talk about Ed's work, his paintings, his books, photos or films, as being about Los Angeles, California, or the West. When they talk about Ed, they describe him as cool. And yes, he's cool. And yeah, the places he paints or photographs are usually in Los Angeles. He's lived here for over 60 years after all. I'm not going to try to explain Ed's work. We only have a few minutes here. But I am going to show you as much as I can. And there's a lot, so buckle up.
Ed, you know, what should people see? Maybe gas stations, maybe. They're streamlined. Everything about it is streamlined. That's what I like.
In the early 60s, Ed was making the 1,000-mile drive from Los Angeles to Oklahoma City a lot.
The thing I really noticed were gasoline stations.
So he took photos of them and published 26 of them in a little book.
Ed said to me at the time, "It's a diary."
Sold the books at $3 a pop.
And I went home and thought about that.
When he ran out, he printed more.
It was kind of a punk move.
It looked like anybody could have done that if they had their eyes open.
One photo in particular stuck with Ed, a standard station outside Amarillo, Texas. He borrowed a composition from the movies. When the Lumiere brothers first showed this in 1896, audiences jumped out of their seats. Standard station's an image Ed revisited many times. Here it is on fire in 1966, burning in 68, with a 10-cent Western being torn in half. An olive. An olive?
Does that mean olive oil? Whatever the joke is, I love it.
Here's what the building looks like today. It's called K&T Automotive Transmission. He used this format on a few paintings from that time. Here's Norm's Diner, also on fire. They tried to tear the building down last year.
You know, architects are into it for what they can do with a space. I'm into it for something else. I'm still trying to understand what that is.
Apartment buildings caught Ed's attention next.
There weren't that many in Oklahoma at the time.
He started photographing them.
Gee, look at these apartment buildings are just totally square.
The buildings have a name,
Like it was a car.
and then the name is in a font.
He made another book, then started drawing some of these pictures.
It was like a nervous compulsion.
I remember growing up thinking how tacky they were, and now they look actually sort of quaint.
He used a motorized camera to shoot a long picture of the Sunset Strip. 2.5 miles became a book that folded out for 27 feet. 25 years later, Ed was still painting buildings. He called these 5 black and white ones his Blue Collar series. 10 years after that, when Ed was invited to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale, he updated those 5 with 5 new color ones.
He looks at them directly without any beauty or mystery, although the paintings are great to look at.
Yeah, they are great to look at. Maybe we should have started with the word paintings. Let's try that. Word paintings, Ed Ruscha. Go.
He's more interested in words than he is in architecture.
You know, it's where Ed started after all. One word knockout straight out of school.
Prior to Ruscha, how many of you took the opportunity to consider the word oof?
Something about these felt inspired by his childhood love of comics. These early paintings got Ed his first big break. Walter Hopps included 3 of them in his breakthrough exhibition at the Pasadena Art Museum, and Ed was the youngest artist included. He also made the poster. In the next few years, he started tweaking his text.
Claiming it, making it his word.
Pulling it apart, first literally, then in his kerning. By the late 60s, Ed was making it look like his text was made of maple syrup, jelly, beans, water.
He had an enormous amount of skill for a young guy in terms of handling paint. And also, it's funny.
In the early 70s, Ed started painting with actual foods. Chocolate, cilantro, ketchup, caviar, hot sauce.
Anything that he could use to leave his mark.
Here's Ed with some chewing tobacco.
I just picked tobacco just because of the marks it makes.
How can you get romantic about prune juice? You can taste it and see it, or see the stains. He likes the stains. Who would have ever done something like that? Ed Ruscha. That's what he'd do.
He started making drawings using gunpowder a few years prior and made these prints out of squid ink, daffodils, and axle grease in '69.
How does the word jelly look with jelly? Try putting that in your hat before you have ever seen somebody else do it.
A few years later, he made a movie about a car mechanic that goes from grease-covered to pristine.
The movie that I was in is about a mechanic who forgets that he made a date with a girl. He starts out in a small, dirty little garage, ends up in a great big clean garage.
Words were all spoken in this one, save for this great-looking title.
I mean, sometimes when you finish a painting, you feel clean.
By the late 70s, he worked clouds into the background, and in '82, he standardized his type with a font he calls Boy Scout Utility Modern.
It looked like it was done by a lineman for the telephone company, you know, and he's asked to make the poster for the annual picnic.
In the '80s, the phrases got longer. He could kind of make sense of little stories here and there.
You right away when you hear a phrase like that, you want to know, who is she and why did they call her Styrene?
'85 brought about the first of these city lights and the first appearance of censor strips, kind of like redacted government documents. In 1997, he started painting these majestic mountains. As much as I like Ed's words, and he's got a few, he's just as good without them. 1997, Picture Without Words. He'd been making sketches of it for over 25 years, and you can kind of look at it forever.
It's a godlike painting.
So what's the secret? What makes Ed Ruscha keep painting every day over 50 years later?
I think he came from a different place. He had a different source, the direct source of reality. Like a person from another planet would come in here and see this stuff directly. That's it.
Ed Ruscha. Amen.
So there you have it. Some of the greatest artists and the pantheon of artists and the artists who uniquely saw the West. So I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll get to a few more questions in the time that we have remaining, but just wanted to remind you that the third and last in this series will go from the West to New York, New York. And there we will see the artists who changed modern art. Yet again, Frank Stella, William de Kooning, Helen Frankenthaler, and Jasper Johns. So I hope you will join me again, same time, same place next week.
So Bob, just a couple of comments if we have time for that. I don't have a question, but have to say how much I'm enjoying this presentation. Bob's choices of images and videos are fantastic, and his comments have been illuminating, really wonderful. That's from Berkeley Cameron, who also says fabulous. A question from Sonia Nunez. Are there any exhibits of Ruscha nearby?
I don't know the answer to that question, so that's your homework assignment. And that is
for next week.
Let's go to Professor Google and say Ed Ruscha exhibitions. Let's go see with any of these artists what's going on, or where can I see their works. And also when you do go to Google Images and you do see these works, and that's certainly a source where I am finding much of the artworks, I always try to, and sometimes I forget to include the source. Where is the painting? In what collection? In what museum? So spend some time there. Any and all the artists I'm talking about are well represented at Google Images. So you can see some more of their work, but also see, hey, I wonder where I could see it in person, which of course is the best way to see the art.
And more notes of appreciation for introducing us to Diebenkorn and Ruscha. So much to learn. And a few of you are asking whether this presentation has been recorded. It will be posted on our website probably by next week. So you can search recording on our website, guilfordfreelibrary.org, to view the entire presentation again, if you like. Thank you so much, Bob.
And just one last, it's a pop quiz question, and I had to go to my Lifeline to get the answer, because in that little film we saw on Ansel Adams, where the curator and the young man are looking at the Ansel Adams photograph, it was driving me nuts. Who is that guy? He looks kind of familiar. I'm assuming maybe he's an actor, a musician. I heard her say Tom. So I did have to go to my Lifeline. My son, Jamie, send that little clip to him. I said, who is this guy? And he quickly, in about 3 seconds, sent back. His name is Tom Cavanaugh. He's an actor, producer, director. And those of you who are familiar with the TV series Scrubs, he starred in that. So just in case you were wondering, like I was, who is that guy? So thanks, everyone. And again, hope to see you back here next week. Glad you enjoyed today's art lecture.
Thank you, Bob.
Bye-bye now.